Welcome everyone to episode 120 of EDH Commander Challenge. I'm your host, BT. Hope you guys are enjoying a great holiday season, and we're here for the second of our 4 episodes of our Holiday Battle Royale featuring multiplayer matches, 4 players all month long. We need to apologize for this episode being out a little bit late. It's been more or less a combination of 2 things. First, trying to get my Christmas shopping done before my birthday on the 17th. And also been going through a little bit of pain in my right foot. I think it's because I fell in a patch of ice recently, but man, when I put pressure on it, it feels like somebody's swinging a hammer down on it. It's so annoying. So here I am hoping that the pain goes away in the next couple of days because I don't want this to last the duration of my vacation. So I do apologize once again, guys, for the episode being up a little bit late. Without any further ado, let's get right into it and go check out those opening hands. First, in this corner, with an opening hand of a Plains, Caves of Koilos, Plateau, Tainted Peak, Path to Exile, Karmic Guide, Mentor of the Meek, and his Mardu-style general, Alesha, who smiles at death. He is the silent Sir Armin. Next, in this corner, with an opening hand of Llanowar Wastes, Woodland Cemetery, Bayou, Soul Ring, Survival of the Fittest, Reclamation Sage, Grim Haruspect, and his Golgari-style general Meren of Clan Toth. He is our playgroup's GP specialist. This is Eric. Next, in this corner, with an opening hand of a Forest, Command Tower, Prov, Spires of Order, Rhystic Study, Incubation Druid, Wirewood Channeler, Sylvan Caryatid, and his Bant-style General Chulane, Teller of Tales. He is the #1 fan of infinite combos. This is Mark. And finally, in this corner, with an opening hand of 4 islands, Cyclonic Rift, Silvermere, Mimic Vat, and featuring his mono blue style Psy Master Thopterist, he is the perfectionist, Phil. Armin won the dice roll off camera, so he'll be starting us off, so let's begin the card fight. For their first turns, Armin plays a Tainted Peak. Mark plays a Command Tower. Phil plays an Island. Eric plays a Bayou and has a turn 1 Soul Ring. Armin plays a Plateau and passes. Mark plays a Forest and casts Sylvan Caryatid and passes. Phil plays a Basic and casts Silvermere and passes. Eric plays Woodland Cemetery and casts Survival of the Fittest and passes. Armin plays a Plains and casts Mentor of the Meek and passes. Mark plays Prov, Spires of Order and casts Incubation Druid and passes. Phil plays a Basic and casts the first general of the game, Psy Master Thopterist, and passes. During his end step, Eric discards a creature to his Survival of the Fittest and adds Solemn Simulacrum from his deck to his hand. Eric plays Llanowar Wastes and casts the aforementioned Solemn Simulacrum, gaining a free swamp from his deck into play tapped and passes. Armin plays Caves of Koilos and casts his general Alesha and passes. Mark casts Rhystic Study and passes. Phil plays a Basic and casts Grim Monolith. With his size trigger, he gets to make a Thopter token. Then he casts Phyrexian Altar, allowing him to make a second token. He doesn't pay the study tax for either spell, so Mark gets to draw 2 cards total. Then Phil passes the turn. Eric casts Reclamation Sage and doesn't pay the study tax, letting Mark draw a card. However, he does use the Sage's trigger to blow the study up. Next, he casts Fleshbag Marauder, causing each player to sacrifice a creature. As his Solemn dies, Eric draws a card and then passes the turn. Armin plays a Plains and then attacks Eric with Alesha. He uses her trigger to reanimate his mentor, which he sends at Phil. Phil blocks the mentor with Psy and his Thopter. Armin assigns the damage to the Thopter, which dies along with his mentor, while Eric takes 3. Then Armin passes to Mark. For Mark's turn, he casts Wirewood Channeler and passes. Phil plays Urza's Mine and casts Mimic Vat, gaining a Thopter token in the process from Psy, and passes. Eric starts his turn by casting his general, Meren of Clandale Toth. He then moves into combat and attacks Mark with his Sage and Marauder. Mark declares no blocks and takes the damage before Eric passes the turn. During his end step, Meren turns Solemn to his hand. Armin plays Badlands and casts Chainer Nightmare Adept. Phil, however, isn't a fan of said card and thus casts Arcane Denial, countering it. As a result, Armin passes the turn. During Mark's upkeep, Armin and Phil gain their bonus card draws from the second effect of the denial. Mark then casts his general, Chulane, Teller of Tales, followed by Llanowar Elves, drawing a card from Chulane's trigger, and finally, he plays Polluted Delta before passing. Phil plays Mystic Sanctuary and uses its effect to place Arcane Denial on the top of his deck. Then he casts Spawning Pit, which makes him another Thopter token. He then uses Psy's second effect and sacks his Thopters to draw a card. Next, he casts Trophy Mage, which allows him to add Proteus Staff from his deck to his hand before passing. Eric moves into combat right away on his turn and attacks Phil with Meren. Phil blocks the hit with his Mage and then exiles it to his Mimic Vat. In his second main phase, Eric recasts his Solemn to grab another basic from his deck into play tapped before passing the turn. During his end step, he uses Meren's effect to add his Grim Haruspect in the graveyard back to his hand. Armin plays an Expedition-style Rugged Prairie and casts Karmic Guide. But Phil counters him again with an Arcane Denial. Armin moves to combat and attacks Phil with Alesha. He uses her trigger to reanimate said Karmic Guide, also tapped and attacking Phil. Thanks to the Guide's ability, he also gets to reanimate Chainer from it. Phil blocks Alesha with Psy and takes the hit from the Guide. Then, Armin passes. During his end step, Mark pays 1 life to sack his Delta and gets to place Breeding Pool from his deck into play tapped. During Mark's upkeep, again Phil and Armin get bonus draws from the secondary effect of Arcane Denial. Mark casts Soul Ring, followed by Uvenwald Hydra, which allows him to add Nykthos Shrine to Nyx from his deck into play tapped. He then plays a forest and casts Magus of the Candelabra, which thanks to Chulane lets him draw a card and play an island before passing. Phil casts Thought Vessel, gaining a Thopter token, followed by the Proteus staff he added to his hand last turn, gaining another Thopter. He decides to use the staff right away, trading a Thopter, and reveals cards from his deck until he hits Trinket Mage. The Trinket Mage's trigger also allows him to add Soul Ring from his deck to his hand, before passing. During the end step, Eric discards a creature to his Survival of the Fittest to add Acidic Slime from his deck to his hand. For Eric's turn, he casts the aforementioned Acidic Slime. He uses its trigger to destroy the Mimic Vat. Next, he casts Viscera Seer. He sacks his Solemn to the Seer to draw a card, and gains his first experience counter, as well as a Scry. He chooses to leave the card on top. Then he passes, and during his end step, uses Meren to reanimate his Elvish Mystic from the graveyard to the field. Armin doesn't pay the Echo, and sacrifices Karmic Guide during his upkeep. Then he plays a Scrubland, and casts Goblin Bombardment. Next, he discards a card to Chainer, and is able to reanimate Mentor of the Meek with it. Next, he moves into combat and attacks Phil with Alesha. He uses her trigger to reanimate the Karmic Guide, who also attacks Phil. He uses his Mentor of the Meek's effect, paying 1 mana to draw a card when the guide comes into play. Phil blocks Alesha with Psy, and takes 2 damage from the guide. After that, Armin sacks the guide to the bombardment to deal Psy 1 damage to finish it off. But in response, Phil sacks Psy to his spawning pit to place a counter on it. Then Armin passes. During the end step, Mark uses Chulane's effect to bounce his elves back to his hand. Mark uses Nykthos for his devotion to green, which is currently 6, and recasts back his elves, which triggers Chulane, letting him draw a card, and he plays a forest. He then uses 3 of his floating mana to use Chulane to bounce his elves back to his hand again. Then he recasts the elves once more, drawing another card. Next, he casts Corridor Monitor, drawing another card while the Monitor's effect untaps Chulane. Next, he uses his Magus to untap Nykthos. He then uses Nykthos again for green, this time having 7 devotion. He then casts Wood Elves, drawing from Chulane, and fetches a free Savannah from his deck into play. He keeps the value train going by casting Selfless Spirit, drawing another card, and playing a forest. He then uses Chulane's bounce effect on the Monitor, and then recasts it once more to draw a card again, and the Monitor untaps Chulane before finally passing to Phil. While Mark's turn was super long, Phil's is the polar opposite, as he simply casts Mystic Remora and passes. During the end step, Eric taps his Waste for a green, taking 1 damage, to discard a creature to his survival, and adds the dreaded Protein Hulk from his deck to his hand. Eric wastes no time in casting said Protein Hulk, which he then sacks to his Seer, getting another experience counter, and with its crazy effect, he gets to add 6 converted mana cost worth of creatures from his deck into play. He then chooses the infamous Walking Belissa and Machias the Unhallowed combo. He then scries his top card to the bottom, and Eric revealed he intends to go with an infinite damage combo now and win the game. He sacks the Belissa to the Seer to begin the combo. However, in response to the Undying trigger, Phil saves the rest of the table with another infamous card in Cyclonic Rift. He uses this with Overload to bounce everyone's non-land permanents back to their hand except his own. Although I think he accidentally overpaid for this in his excitement and sacked the Thopter to his altar unnecessarily, but oh well. In response to the Rift, Eric sacks his creatures one by one to his Seer, which then come back with Undying, giving him a ton of experience counters. But he always keeps the scryed card on top. First he sacks his Sage and his Slime, and when they come back into play, he uses their triggers to get a small form of payback on Phil, blowing up his Staff and Remora. Then he sacks both of them again for more experience counters. He then sacks the Flesh Bag, which comes back with Undying, forcing each player to sack a creature. And then sacks it again for yet another experience counter. Then the Cyclonic Rift finally resolves and all but Phil's non-land permanents are bounced, and the Belissa comes back into play with a +1/+1 counter. Then Eric passes and moves to discard down to 7 cards. Armin plays Godless Shrine untapped, paying 2 life, and recasts Chainer again. He then discards Alesha to Chainer and casts her off his effect from the graveyard. This also grants her haste. He then attacks Eric with her and uses her trigger to bring back Karmic Guide, which is attacking Phil, who in turn reanimates Mentor of the Meek. Both players decide to take their hits, and then Armin passes. Mark recasts Soul Ring and Wood Elves, which allows him to get a free forest from his deck into play, followed by Finhorn Elves and Elvish Reclaimer, before passing. Phil plays his Soul Ring, followed by Teferi Temporal Archmage. He downticks it to untap 4 permanents. Next he casts Fabricate to add Duplicant from his deck to his hand. He then casts it and targets the Belissa. In response, Eric uses Belissa's counter to kill the Finhorn Elves, allowing it to die and the Duplicant loses its target. Then Phil passes. Eric casts Pernicious Deed and passes. Armin doesn't pay the Echo to his Karmic Guide during his upkeep and sacrifices it. He plays Graven Carns and recasts Goblin Bombardment, followed by Faceless Butcher, in which he uses the Butcher's permanent exile loophole by targeting Duplicant for removal and then sacks into the Bombardment to kill the Wood Elves while the exile ability is still on the stack. In response, Phil sacks the Duplicant to Spawning Pit. Next, Armin discards a card to Chainer's ability, to which Phil responds by removing 2 counters from his pit to make a 2/2 Spawn token. Armin then enters combat and attacks Teferi with Alesha. With her trigger, he brings back Karmic Guide, who is also attacking Teferi, while the Guide's trigger reanimates Solemn Simulacrum, allowing him to get a basic land from his deck into play tapped. Phil uses the spawn token to block Alesha and sack it back to the spawning pit, while Teferi takes 2 damage from the guide before the turn comes to an end. Mark recasts his Uvenwald Hydra, getting an Alchemist's Refuge into play tapped, and then passes the turn. Phil upticks Teferi and checks his top 2 cards, adding one of them to his hand and placing the other on the bottom of his deck. He then casts Ugin. He uses its -3 ability to force Eric to use his deed, which shockingly, Eric does not, and allows it to be destroyed, leaving the table in disbelief. Finally, Phil casts Blinkmoth Urn and passes. For Eric's turn, he casts Noxious Gearhulk and destroys the Hydra, gaining 12 life in the process. Then he recasts his Viscera Seer and passes. However, during the end step, Armin sacks his guide to the bombardment and shoots the Seer, to which Eric responds by sacrificing it to scry 1 and places the card on the bottom of his deck. Then Armin casts Path to Exile on the Gearhulk, exiling it and allowing Eric to grab a basic from his deck into play. Armin plays a Fetid Heath and discards a card to Chainer. Then he recasts Karmic Guide with it, and with its trigger, he revives his Faceless Butcher. He uses the Butcher to exile the Reclaimer, and with its ability on stack, he sacrifices it to the bombardment to shoot Ugin for 1 and take it out. He then moves into combat and attacks Teferi with Alesha, Solemn, and Chainer. Via Alesha's effect, he brings up the card he discarded earlier, which turns out to be none other than Master of Cruelties, which makes the whole table gasp, and he has it attack Eric. We move to damage, Teferi dies, and Eric drops to 1 life. In his second main phase, Armin casts Return to Dust and exiles both Phil's Urn and Pit before passing. Mark draws and simply passes to everyone's surprise. Phil recasts Sigh and passes. Eric casts Mind Slicer, and then recasts Meren before passing, and during the end step brings back Fleshbag Marauder, forcing everyone to sacrifice a creature. And Mind Slicer dying causes each player to discard their hand. Mark responds to the Mind Slicer and uses his refuge so that he can flash cards into play, and thus flashes in Mirari's Wake. Randomly, Phil tries to stop it with an Unwind, just because he'd have to discard it, which makes the rest of us at the table LOL hardcore. However, Mark just says get wrecked and flashes in Glenelendra Archmage and sacks it to counter the Unwind, which was hilarious to watch. Then Mind Slicer resolves and everyone discards their hands. And now the coast is clear, Armin sacks his guide to shoot Eric for 1 and eliminates him. For Armin's turn, he sacks his Solemn to deal 1 damage to the Archmage. Then discards a card to Chainer's ability to reanimate Karmic Guide, who in turn reanimates Butcher. He uses it to exile Sigh, and with his trigger on the stack, realized that since the Wake is out, he would need to sack it to the bombardment to kill the Archmage. He then moves into combat and attacks Phil with Alesha, Chainer, and the Mentor. With Alesha's trigger, he revives the Master of Cruelties he sacked last turn and sends it Mark's way. We move to damage. Both players take their hit with Mark dropping to 1 life. And in his second main phase, Armin casts Recruiter of the Guard, adding and then casting Stoneforge Mystic, which in turn adds the equipment Sword of Fire and Ice from his deck to his hand. And finally, he sacks his Recruiter to the Bombardment and deals the final damage to Mark, eliminating him before passing to Phil. Phil casts Phyrexian Metamorph, losing 2 life to pay part of its cost, and has it become a copy of Karmic Guide. This allows him to reanimate Duplicant, which he targets Alesha with. Armin responds by sacking into the Bombardment to shoot Phil for 1. Then Phil sacks his Duplicant to his altar to help recast Psy before passing. Armin doesn't pay the Echo again and sacks his Karmic Guide during his upkeep. He then discards a card to Chainer and brings back Alesha, who has haste. He uses his Mystic to drop in his Sword of Fire and Ice. Then Armin sacks 2 creatures to the Bombardment to kill the copied Karmic Guide. Then he equips his sword to his Master, which now can't be blocked, and knowing that he's beat to the Master attacking, followed by a Bombardment shot, Phil scoops, and Armin takes the dominant victory. Eric would have won had it not been for that timely Cyclonic Rift. I also have to say, survival of the fittest in terms of money is expensive, but I can fully understand why. It's a must-have in most any deck that runs green, and Reanimator decks love it the most. Mark's Chulane deck looks like a massive value train, but sadly, despite having the most land drops and card draw, his deck didn't really do anything. He was trying to play around Eric's Pernicious Deed, and while he may have had a strategy to deal with Armin, we'll never know since Mind Slicer discarded his hand, and Phil forced him to use up all of his mana to save his Wake from being countered. Phil's plays were a bit confusing to me. Counterspelling Armin's creatures without having a way of stealing them, or flat out sealing off Armin's access to the graveyard is a bit questionable. If I was him, when Armin began to take control, I would have likely tried to form an alliance with Mark to slow Armin down, but oh well. His Proteus Staff, however, with Psy is a beautiful idea. The only problem with that is it's a bit of a slow setup. I was hoping he would have had cards like Ensnaring Bridge or Vidalcan Shackles to buy himself some time. Now, since I couldn't really pick which card really did the most work for Armin in this game, I've been instructed to read the following lines for you. He will always try to control you. Sacrifice a creature and bombard you with those moves by Armin, those crazy moves by Armin, those crazy moves by Armin. Well, he does have the right to brag. I mean, he came out like an RKO out of nowhere with that Master of Cruelties, and being able to bring back creatures at will with his General Alesha or Karmic Guide or Chainer made sure that really it would be hard for him to lose anything. And that was probably the best control style Mardu deck I've ever seen. Agree with our picks? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoy our content, consider becoming a patron. Give you access to some sweet bonuses while helping out the channel at the same time. Thanks everyone, and happy holidays. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you're a fan of EDH gameplay and you like whether it be 1v1 or multiplayer and you want to be part of the ever-growing Commander Challenge family, just make sure you smash the subscribe button and notification bell down below. We do weekly videos. Don't forget as well to like, comment, share our videos, but most importantly, enjoy them. On behalf of all of our members here, I'm your host, BT. Feel free to check out all of the videos in the channel, join our game, it's now your turn. Cheers!